dramatically. So that's the biggest jump over there in food, but because housing is a bigger portion of the overall budget, it is one of the biggest drivers of the overall increase. So the cost of housing first, and this is based on the rental of a 3-bedroom apartment or a townhouse in the region. And then other household expenses also has done a big jump. And this is mostly sort of supply chain issues and shortages have been driving costs up all the way across. So if folks are going into the drugstore to pick up some non-medical supplies, paying out of pocket for prescriptions and other things, that jump is up 22% too. Slide. So what you can see here is the breakdown of what we've calculated in the living wage for overall household expenses. You've got, like I said, some parent education costs, some contingency funds, some non-MSP healthcare costs, childcare, other household expenses, transportation, shelter and communications, clothing and footwear, and food. And you'll see here that shelter and telecommunications is the biggest, like I said, the biggest part of that overall budget. And then you'll see that childcare and food follow quickly. Okay. Where we see the most growth, like I said, was food. So 25.7% increase in the food budget for this household this year. And then other household expenses, like I said, also up. The one area that's gone down is childcare. And this is a really important part of the story around the living wage this year, is that the only area where costs went slightly down. Now, as you saw in that previous slide, childcare costs are still a significant cost for these households. So it's still a big driver of overall household cost. But the government's $10 a day childcare program and investments in childcare staffing and supports has meant that it hasn't grown like other areas have. And in 2019, we actually saw the living wage go down. The overall living wage went down that year because of the government's childcare investments. So this is an important part of the story that tells us that government action around a particular area in this budget for families can make a difference on cost of living. Slide. Just to give you a context for how we compare with other regions across the province, this is the first year that Greater Victoria's living wage has outpaced Vancouver's. And that's quite significant. And that's being driven heavily by the food costs of transportation and food costs coming to for things coming to the island. And you'll see that all the way across the province, the living wages are quite comparable in the 20 to 25 range. And the only one that's slightly ahead of us is Golden. And they're, as a remote and mountain-based community, those transportation costs are similarly high to an island community. Now, I'd like to introduce the panelists that are going to help us to unpack some of this today around what does this living wage mean for individuals, communities, and families and businesses across the region. And I'll start by introducing Pamela Charron. Pamela is the new, I think, Executive Director of the Worker Solidarity Network, formerly known as the Retail Action Network. And this is a group of non-unionized workers that are often in the precarious sector across BC, advocating for the rights of interested workers and helping them to take collective action. And Pamela has been in that sector herself for a long time, so has experienced the working conditions in that sector, in the restaurant industry in particular, for over a decade, and joined the Worker Solidarity Network over 3 years ago to start to advocate for change in the sector. And then we have Bronwyn Farley, who is the office manager at the Umbrella Society. The Umbrella Society is one of the partners that the Planning Council works with regularly and does incredible work in the community, providing mental health and substance use supports to individuals and their loved ones. Started in 2000 and have services around outreach, recovery housing, counseling, harm reduction, and education. So just incredibly important services. Everybody knows the need for that in Victoria today. Bronwyn also has kids at home and loves her bio talks about how much she loves to cook and sing with their kids, which is really fun. And I think a really important part of balancing the kind of work that we do in our sector with making sure we're having fun at home. And Calen McNeil is the founder of Big Wheel Burger, Canada's first carbon neutral fast food restaurant chain on Vancouver Island, another partner agency that the Planning Council is really excited to work with. And Calen started the Big Wheel Foundation. It's a private foundation that raises money for charitable causes for citizens in need. And since its inception, it started in 2018, which was very fortuitous given the pandemic rolled in, and raised $370,000 for organizations supporting food security, unhoused populations, basic income, end-of-life care, community gardens, and others. And just such an incredible broad range of important causes that support vulnerable members in our community today. I'll start by going over to Pamela, and just to let folks know, we'll be watching the chat for comments and questions. So feel free to open up questions in the chat, and we'll bring those over into the main conversation. And I'll start with you, Pamela, just to kind of a response to what's happened with the living wage this year and that major jump, and how that resonates with you from the worker perspective.
Thanks, Diana. Excuse me. Hi, everyone. I have a bit of a cold, so I hope that you could all hear me well. Yeah, the WSN, the Worker Solidarity Network, welcomes the living wage campaign and applauds all employers that provide living wage to their employees. This initiative enables more workers to have a living wage, and employers can have a really, really important role to play to advance decent work and address working poverty in their operations, and by improving and promoting living wages. Providing employees a living wage is a really, really important tool and powerful tool to reduce poverty, but it also supports the spread of gender equality by ensuring women and transgender people receive equitable wages, essentially boosting the income of all the world's lowest paid workers would be a powerful driver of social and political inclusion and reducing social and economic inequality. But working poverty is still a reality in BC, and the government set minimum wage falls far short from the living wage calculations. And the current minimum wage falls $8.64 short of what workers need to survive in Victoria, right? With no plan in sight to bridge the gap that wasn't adjusted frequently enough to keep up with inflation. And the living wage campaign is a response to the fact that minimum wage, for different reasons, often falls short to meet workers' basic needs. But ensuring that workers have access to decent work starts in this room and continues to go, and we could lift the floor together to make sure that we provide workers the means to spend time with their friends and family and enjoying cultural activities and taking care of one's health, and since everyone has the right to having a good quality of life.
Thanks, Pamela. I like that concept of kind of this is our collective effort to lift the floor together. So I'll jump over to Bronwyn, if you can.
Thanks, Diana, and thank you for that, Pamela. I'm going to try to be brief because I'm such a fan of the Living Wage for Families campaign. Umbrella has been certified as a living wage employer since 2017, and it's been an important challenge for us to meet. And it's important that we recognize that this is the current living wage in Victoria. It is a large jump, and there's a lot of reasons behind it, and our staff feel it and our community feels it. And we work with a lot of marginalized people on a regular basis, and the people that we work with, the people that we serve, but also the people that we hire and employ are people with lived experience with mental health and addictions and substance use issues. And they do this work because it's important work to do, and because we are actively trying to save lives on a regular basis, and people should not be impoverished by doing that important work. And I think as challenging as the updated living wage is for employers in this sector, this work is challenging, and we need to recognize that if we don't take care of the people who are taking care of the people, everyone suffers in our community. So when we look at that new living wage and the challenge that it is to us, it's far more challenging to be an employee in the current economic situation that we find ourselves in. So we just have to push harder and dig deeper.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're in the similar sector, right? That concept that if you're doing work to care for others, somehow it doesn't get compensated the same way. And I know the province has really stepped in around incomes for childcare workers because they were suffering such a shortage. But I think that the social sector across the whole sector is seeing that. And a lot of that's the ability to try and step up the salaries. Calen, you probably are seeing labor shortages too over there. So maybe you can jump in on this one now.
Yes, thanks, Diana. And great points from Pamela and Bronwyn. Obviously, industry is a significant change maker in this area, and we have the opportunity to elevate wages within a broad idea, but very narrow scope. I think everybody deserves to make a living wage. I think that goes without question. I'm an organization that's been aspiring to be a certified living wage employer, and we got very close. We just this year launched the 1950 starting full-time wage. We don't factor in gratuities, of course. Gratuities are around $6 an hour for our workers. That's another issue, but so we're kind of feeling like we're knocking on the door of becoming certified. This sort of stretches it to a point that is, we're kind of going back to the table and trying to figure out what this means. I had a conversation with Sam Jones from 2% Jazz earlier, who is a certified living wage employer, and the 20% jump, like there's two issues. There's one primary issue is that this is what the reality is. Inflation this past year has been crazy, and that's what the living wage is. The other part is trying to figure out how, as a business, you can have another segment that jumps that degree in 1 year. We've had, Diana touched on the price of food and all of that. So we're coming at it from a number of different angles. I think as an employer, I want my staff to be able to live in the community that we are and be able to share in the fruits of this particular beautiful location of Southern Vancouver Island. But, it is becoming increasingly harder for people to do. The one thing that I hear a lot of is people leaving our community for lower price communities to live, which is totally understandable, but it does put a pressure on the staff. I mean, staffing this year was our single biggest challenge. I think because we've always paid significantly more than minimum wage at our organization with benefits, I think we've been sheltered a little bit, but I think that goes to speak to the benefit of paying higher wages. You do get higher retention, less turnover, and all those things. So what I'm grappling with as an organization is just how to get to that certified living wage approach, and honestly wondering if there is other ways that we can inspire other organizations to do the same, but also try to figure out how we can lift everybody up. And I think there's a side benefit of the intention to try to become a living wage employer is, I know that our hourly wage is up about almost $3 an hour since we embarked on this probably 3 years ago. And we are approaching what the old minimum wage or the old living wage was. So I think all those things are encouraging, but I also think that we do need to try to look to the other layers of government to try to lower the inputs, the costs. So in business, you want to boost your revenue and keep your costs tight, but always chasing the top number as far as the costs without trying to figure out ways that we can actually significantly lower inflation, but also lower the cost of inputs is important. So government, it will have to play a part in that as well in order for us to be able to become a certified living wage employer, which is our goal, and still is, even with this number. As crazy as it sounds for me, I'm going to try to do it. So it's
a little bit like you were sprinting to the end of a finish line on a marathon, and
so close.
I know, you guys were within spitting distance, and then the finish line just got dramatically moved. At the same time as on the other end, you're seeing that inflation, it hits the business input costs at the same time as it's hitting the household input costs. So it feels like you guys kind of had that finish line moved.
I hate losing, so I got to just work out harder, I guess.
It's great that you guys are still showing that commitment. And I also really like that what you raised around how just the existence of the living wage does help raise that floor. And Pamela was saying that kind of lifting the floor for everyone, that the existence of this. So as long as you rely on a minimum wage that's inadequate, people think that's okay. But this living wage conversation alone helps to push wages up more. So that's great to hear, because that's a really nice outcome, despite the fact that some employers might not be yet ready to be able to be fully certified. It is still lifting the floor for many of those employers. I wanted to ask around, Pamela, around, you mentioned gender equity and inequality. And I know that the living wage is part of that, that women are more disproportionately concentrated in low income and kind of low income jobs. But also we see that for BIPOC and LGBTQ plus and other folks with different identities and visible minorities, that there is a concentration in lower income. And so does the living wage play a part in discrimination and inequality more broadly?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. At the WSN, we're hearing from workers that we support is that they're facing discrimination in the workplace on multiple levels, and especially on the basis of mental health. But what's more, we're seeing that low wage precarious workers are facing rampant workplace violations in regards to monetary entitlements, such as regular wages, overtime, stop pay, compensation, and so on. And due to this, as low wage workers are often questioning if they're going to be able to pay their bills and rent on time, they would rather accept that their rights are being violated because they don't want to risk losing their jobs. And we know that racialized and equity seeking workers have a higher risk of facing retaliation and discrimination in the workplace for addressing their rights at work, and in turn not being able to make ends meet for themselves and for their families. So the power dynamics between employers and workers has shifted over the last decade, exposing precarious workers to increased health and economic inequities, as well as government has failed to appropriately regulate the labor market and protect workers from these harms. But a living wage could provide workers, precarious workers and equity identity groups, the economic and mental capacity to build power amongst and with workers to be able to influence employment and workplace conditions, such as ending discrimination in the workplace.
That's it's an important conversation for us to have, is to recognize that although there are employers that are really stepping up to the plate on this, there are other employers where those challenges, are still very present. And so we see it also in the housing market. The tighter the housing market gets, the harder it is for folks that are visible minority, single parents, anybody with a diverse identity and disabilities to get housing. So we see it, one of our recent report on the drivers of homelessness found that, when all other things considered equal, those populations are disproportionately represented in housing insecurity and eviction and homelessness. So we do need to make sure that we recognize that tools like the living wage can help bring that floor up, but it does reduce some of that really big inequality. And then I wanted to ask Bronwyn if you wanted to speak a little bit more to any policy levers you might see that might help with addressing some of the living wage, kind of some of the challenges we see around the living wage. Is there other opportunities there that we haven't, childcare has made a difference? Are there other areas where we could see investments in families and communities that might help with the cost side for you guys?
Well, with the cost side for us, it is really broad, because we are, it is across the board, all of those many, values that have been inflated for everybody. We're all just families and people who are kind of struggling with everything, and it's accessing the resources that are kind of beyond the beyond for a lot of the people that we're working with and that we work alongside, like accessing healthcare support that kind of goes beyond the basic, the mental health care support, those things. For us, a lot of it, the conversation when it comes to staffing and cost of living and those things really drills down to the conversation around staff burnout and staff retention, and what are the things that are causing our staff to become unwell on a kind of social scale across the board in our sector. Where are we not kind of meeting those needs that our staff have? And so when it comes to living wage, paying people adequately does allow them some space to meet those needs outside of employment. But it would be, considerably easier to have those needs kind of worked into the social fabric already, so that people aren't, spending the time to look for the supports that they will inevitably need as human beings living in a really challenging time, like having those things kind of already set up in community, accessible, having those things in place would make a huge difference, I think, for everyone across the board. And again, it's not just about our sector. That's kind of the lens that I have, but it is about lifting up all employees so that they have access to the tools that they need to be employees. We can't sustain employment for people if they are not well enough to be employed.
It's true. It's particularly challenging in the sector where we're working with populations that are heavily they're in low income and struggling, particularly, some of our team, we're working with folks trying to find them housing. There just is nowhere for people to go. And the incomes just don't line up with housing. So that certainly would be helpful for, for the rent bank team, for example, if there was a living wage for more of those households coming through, it'd be a lot easier because those households would have a higher level of resilience to crises. And if somebody lost a job, they'd have a little bit of savings and ability to bridge through as a household. Or if somebody got sick and things like that. So that resilience isn't really there. There's a question in the chat. I was going to jump to Calen about policy fixes, but before I do, in the chat, there's a question about, does the living wage mean a thriving wage? Like, can I buy a house and save for retirement? I could tackle that, but I'll see if anybody else wants to jump in on that one first. Nobody wants to jump in? Calen, go ahead.
I saw that question. I thought it was very, very good question.
Yeah.
I know from our standpoint and our team standpoint, I spent a lot of time talking to staff, which is a good way, surprise, surprise, to find out what's going on in their life and what stresses they have. And speaking about thriving, when you think about the mental health issues that resulted from the pandemic and our ongoing stresses with finances and whatnot, it's hard to thrive in that environment if you don't feel comfortable. It's the same issue with the unhoused population. It's hard to get better if you don't feel safe, if you don't have a roof over your head and all those basic. It's really fundamental. The Maslow hierarchy of needs is never more prevalent than what we have today for the population. So to say thriving, I would say that it doesn't thrive, but if you look at where people would be just on the basic minimum wage, an $8 uptick an hour, which represents, a significant daily wage difference or gap, then I would say it would lead to people to thrive. And obviously it depends on what your personal individual needs are. And I just wanted to make a point about the different employers. Obviously we have a whole range of employees. And, obviously our store managers and assistant managers and supervisors and, senior leadership team and all of that are well over minimum or living wage requirements. There's also a big segment of our staff that still live at home. Their parents are both working and they're making well above minimum wage in most cases. That's not every case, because there is we've had employees that have been taking care of their parents. And I think there is a wide gap between what each individual employee's actual needs are. And we've also got employees where they're, forced to work because their mom or dad want them to work and they don't really need financially to work. So, there is some employees getting 25, they'd be thriving because they would have money coming in from every direction. But yeah, I think it's case by case in my opinion, as far as whether people are thriving or not. But I do think it is a minimum starting point to thrive.
Yeah, and the way we talk about it from the Social Planning Council is that it gives a dignified income. So it's not an income that would allow you to buy a house. And I'll ask Connor, who did the calculations, how much is in there for any kind of savings or anything like that. I think there's a bit of contingency funding, but that's more for bridging through a crisis if somebody lost a job or was unwell or a kid got sick or a car breaks down and needs to be repaired. Like that's that's bridging you through an unexpected crisis that involves a financial hit versus being able to have enough beyond that to also then save for retirement and buy a house. But it does give a dignified income. So, it does have some funding in there where the family isn't going to have to choose between food and shoes and new shoes for a kid, or food and a phone. And we have a lot of families coming through the rent bank that they've had to give up their phone and their internet, and it's super hard then to come out of the hole and get a job when you don't have a place to leave messages for employers. So it does move you beyond that to the place where you're not having to choose between essentials at the end of the month. And so you have some dignity, and you're not having to say no to your kid going on a field trip, or ask for them to, when a kid graduates, you have to pay for the cap and gown these days. Like everything at school you have to pay for. It's incredible how much stuff I'm coming through. Bills are constantly coming into our household. And I looked, I was like, how can people who are low income, like, you have to pay for your kid's grad cap? Like, it gives you enough dignity where you don't have to be the person that says, I can't afford to pay for my kid's graduation cap and gown. But it doesn't move you too far beyond that. And Connor, I don't know if you wanted to make a few comments about that.
Yeah, so we insert a contingency fund, which is roughly about 4%, just to cover those unexpected costs. Is that kind of
the crises? Yeah. And is there anything in there for savings, Connor? Like if somebody wanted to, build towards buying a house and save for their retirement?
Not necessarily, no.
Yeah.
The contingency fund is kind of this this designated about $300 a month, where it could be put towards the savings account, but it also could cover those unexpected costs.
Yeah. And somebody asked if it includes kids' sports.
Well, just within it being a contingency fund, it can be allocated as they feel. This isn't. This is like
other household expenses could be, some of those other household expenses include, like, kids' birthday presents, and so there's a little bit of room in there depending what your costs are in a month of being able to pay for a couple of those extra fees for kids.
But in terms of clothing for sporting or something, we do also have the clothing section of our breakdown. There are things that kind of overlap. The contingency fund is there to fill in the missing blanks.
Thanks. Calen, did you want to jump in now on that question? We were talking a little bit previously about some of the things that could be done around the cost drivers. And I know that you guys are seeing, so there's two places. One is for the household, we've seen the living wage go down when the government invested in childcare. There's other ways that the government could be helping to bring the living wage down so that it's not on the backs of workers and business. And then the other area for you guys is to free up a little space for you guys to pay a living wage if there were ways that the cost inputs for you around the supply chain costs and the drivers on the business side were affected. So I don't know if you have any suggestions around it. Is there any low-hanging fruit there?
Yeah, some suggestions. Yeah, I can yell and scream, pull up my hair. Obviously, in an inflationary environment like we're in, the tax revenues go up. So their inputs are going up as well, because they obviously the government has employees and things like that. And they're affected by rising fuel prices and all this stuff as well. But, when I see, prices of things going up 20%, everything that we use gets taxed. There's provincial tax, there's employee tax, all those things. As wages are increasing, the government is taking in more money. So I definitely think the other thing, which is another driving factor, is climate change. So, when you look at climate disasters and preparing, it's here, it's upon us, we see it, feel it. There's going to need to be significant investment in mitigating those things. If you look at, what happened in the Fraser Valley, because that was a number one driving of the price of food for us, because we buy a lot of our food from the Fraser Valley. But, had we invested more in the infrastructure of the dike, the impact of that storm would have been less impactful when it comes to the cost of goods and food. So there is a number of drivers, and that also disproportionately affects people that are living below the poverty line, and would be the direct benefit of more people doing living wages. So I definitely think lowering employee taxes would be a way, the burden on business to do that. And also the burden on the employee paying. So as inflation goes up, the tax dollars are coming in at a greater level, giving more, lowering the tax burden on those that are making less than, you know, a living wage, basically. Would help. So it's two ways. It's one, giving the businesses less outputs as far as the tax goes, but then also allowing the employees themselves to pay less tax. So even at you talk about a contingency of 4%, if they're paying 4% less taxes, you know, that in itself could help cover some of the thriving type things, and not leaving people in a situation where they're feeling they can't thrive or survive on a minimum wage.
Right. So that was another avenue we hadn't talked about, really, what was reducing some of those costs for households as well, either through direct transfers or through reducing some of the taxes and fees on those households too. So that's another avenue for opening up a bit of breathing room there. For and we do, when we calculate living wage, we do it as a calculation that includes government transfers and subsidies and taxes and all of those things. So those do factor in, and the more the government does around affordability for households so for example, the climate action tax credit is one of the things the government's done recently to try and give a little bit more money around the carbon tax through to households. So that kind of thing can help reduce the living wage. Bronwyn or Pamela, did you want to jump in at all?
This is not low hanging fruit, but one of the things that directly impacts us, our employees, and us as an employer is the high cost for communication, be it cellular phones or internet. It is like as we are moving more and more towards these forms of communication when it comes to working and supporting people, the burden on us as an employer to have up-to-date, accessible communication tools for everyone, and at the same time, our employees out in the community, they are all paying these exorbitant cell phone bills monthly, and it has a direct impact on the amount of money that they get to keep at the end of the month, and they can't just get rid of it because it is an important tool for us to communicate.
Yeah, and that's a great point. From an organization perspective, that technology side is increasingly needed and more expensive, particularly with that post-pandemic pivot. We pivoted to online during the pandemic, but there's a real expectation. Here we are today. Like, it's just so much easier to continue to engage online and limited in person. And Connor, I know that you mentioned at one point that there had been a change in what we include in the living wage around phones and tech in order to provide that dignified income, with the expectation that families are going to need to stay connected and have access to technology. Do you want to speak to that for a sec?
Absolutely. So certainly we've recognized how integral data is into people's lives now. So part of that is we did, with this iteration of the methodology, we adjusted it and increased the monthly data allowance that people would expect or desire. So we jumped from about 3 gigabytes a month to 4, which is a moderate increase, but it's something that we felt was necessary.
Thanks. Yeah, so part of that moving from surviving to thriving is being able to have cell phone and data access, we thought, for families, and that was part of the province-wide conversation. Just looking to see, I don't see any further comment. Oh, here's some comments in the chat. I know that somebody mentioned that employees are taxed on required cell phones as a taxable benefit. And it might be interesting to look at if some of those benefits that are considered taxable benefits become recognized as essentials. Perhaps that could help with some of that, what you were talking about, Calen, of addressing sort of the employee cost side on taxes, is to open up a bit more space through things like cell phones not being a taxable benefit. And Todd Littman has shared in the chat a lot of links around how Montreal has managed to maintain low rents. We haven't done a deep dive here on the housing side of the living wage, but certainly we all know that housing costs are one of the biggest drivers here. And I know the Planning Council is a certified living wage employer, but even with the living wage, we've lost some of our staff. And ironically, one of our staff, who was a housing researcher, moved on and married to a teacher. So a housing researcher earning a living wage, married to a teacher, left the region and moved to Alberta. And they said, we want to start a family and we just see no future here. which just broke my heart. You know, these are folks that are committed to our community and people we desperately need in our community, folks that have been here for years working on housing and homelessness and teaching our kids, and those folks are leaving because they frankly don't see a future. So this is where we're beyond just a housing affordability crisis. We're at an identity crisis for the city of what kind of city do we want to be. And although we're very committed to the living wage and having this conversation has to be one about the government intervening on housing costs, and the living wage could be brought down. Like, I would love for us to have this exact conversation in a year's time and say, guys, the living wage went down because the government has stepped up to the plate more. All levels of government has stepped up on housing affordability in a way that has meant we fill that major gap we have on affordable housing for lower income housing. We're short around 7,000 or more units in Victoria of housing at the lower income levels. And so Todd's mentioned a couple of things around how Montreal was able to engage around affordable housing. And certainly we learned Montreal was the one that started that pilot on affordable childcare, that like $7 a day childcare. And our government stepped up after that. So maybe it's time for us to bring more examples forward of places like Montreal that are making inroads on housing affordability, so that we can have the living wage be something that we can all, as employers, workers, and nonprofits, be able to do without having all of us be struggling. There's my rant. I don't know if any of you guys wanted to jump in on that housing piece that Todd raised in the chat. Go ahead.
Obviously, you know, it's interesting because I've got locations and we've got a location in Nanaimo, we've got 4 locations in Victoria, and it's amazing. You'd see, I wouldn't thought of this before, that someone in Cook Street, a worker in Cook Street Village versus a worker at our Vic West store or our Gateway store or out in Colwood, what their impacts are when it comes to housing and also choices. So, you know, I've got an employee that, you know, wants to live by themselves, but they have to live with a roommate. So I'm trying to help them find a suitable, you know, 1-bedroom or bachelor so they can live alone and be able to afford it. And, you know, I help them on both ends, you know, in each one of these situations. I try to tend to deal with each person individually and what their needs are. But the disparity in housing availability just within our own community, and how much it costs to live in certain spots, and willingness for workers to move within the city as well. So transportation is part of it as well. And I think, you know, Todd's are all amazing articles and points to Montreal, which is a clear example of, you know, that missing middle that we talk about. And, you know, flexible transportation in any way you can, whether it be by vehicle, bike, or walk, or bus. So I think all of those things tie into it. And, you know, again, I just really want to emphasize the importance of dealing with everybody individually, and, you know, trying to, you know, there's privacy issues in that as well, because even if, you know, one employee has, you know, unique challenges, and that applies to some of our Indigenous staff where they have childhood trauma, very unique set of circumstances where, you know, had we not approached them individually and talked to them privately about what their needs are, we as employers would be meeting their needs, regardless of living wage or not, whether it comes to mental health supports or, I mean, we have provide benefits, but, you know, $500 a year doesn't go very far for mental health supports. So we as an employer pay over and above. So if it's to do in particular with mental health, so there is unique ways you could target individual circumstances, but it's challenging. And yeah, I think, yeah.
And on the housing side, I think I don't know if you guys are looking at this, Bronwyn, but we've been having so much trouble with attracting new staff that we're now in the position, like you mentioned, Calen, of trying to help them find housing. And you know, some of the rent banks across the region have had rent bank staff access the rent banks themselves. So, you know, we definitely, as you know, living wage employers, the issue of housing goes far beyond what gets paid for housing. It's just straight up access. we have some folks that are working from outside the region altogether because they can't find affordable housing here. So that's definitely, you know, goes beyond the living wage into flexibility and creativity. And like you were saying, Calen, like every situation, trying to be as creative as possible to meet people's needs at a time where it's not just wages, but it's also, you know, living and working conditions and access to housing and transportation that are creating really unique barriers for folks. Seeing not much more coming in from the chat here. There's a little bit more around housing, which Planning Council's had a couple of recent forums on housing and homelessness, and we'll have more. So I think it's a pretty huge topic for us to grapple with. But in this, certainly just in terms of the living wages calculation of housing, what we did was we recognized that individuals who've been in housing for a long time pay a lower cost because of rent controls than individuals who have to move because there isn't vacancy control. So the movement between units and into a new unit is associated with a $300 or $400 premium at least, depending on the size of unit. And so we created a model that merges the cost because we're creating an average cost. So some folks who are living in housing that they've been in a long, long time and it's low cost housing may be paying a lot less than what we've calculated into the living wage, but we recognize that folks that have had to move recently will probably be paying more than we've calculated in the living wage. So we had to come up with something that worked across the region. And with households that have recently moved or households that have been in the same place for a long time. So we created a model. It's a hybrid of both, and it's an average, and it's going to be it's really most going to be a conservative estimate, as everything I think in the living wage calculation is overall a conservative estimate. But the housing calculations right now do consider that vacancy premium for somebody who has to move, at least partially. So in that because it's an average. So it's conservative. It might not be quite enough, and we certainly, it doesn't. I don't think it addresses the problem adequately, but it's better than what we did last year because it increases that vacancy premium significantly. And yeah, so just wrap up. If anybody wanted to I'll just give you guys each a minute or so to just wrap up with any last comments about living wage and affordability in the region. Do you want to start, Bronwyn?
Sure, thanks, Diana. You made a comment about the kind of city that we want to live in. And, you know, I was born in Victoria and I lived in a big old 1900s house on a single government income. And I am of a generation of people that cannot afford the houses we were born into. You know, we are a generation who is sadly waiting for our parents' generation to hand down their legacies at some point. That is when we will be able to have that real sense of, okay, I'm safe, I'm going to be okay. So when we look at the kind of community that we want to live in, I think we have to move away from this sense of what we thought we were going to be born into as a community and really move into the sense of, is there room for everyone here? Can we make space for everyone? Can we make sure that every single person in our community is living with dignity and with hope and with the ability to meet their own needs and the needs of their families? And the living wage really challenges us to think about that beyond, you know, the simply like, are they on the street or not? Like, how are we taking care of each other? How are we stepping up to make sure that this is a place where we all want to live and where we want to continue to tell people that we live? You know, like I'm proud to be living here and participating in this panel because I believe that we are all capable of great things when we actively say, this is the kind of community that I want to live in. So I thank you for saying that.
Thanks. Calen, hard act to follow.
Wow. Bronwyn, that was, I'm wishing I had said all those things, but I didn't think of them. You thought of them. I think that's very, I mean, I could add to it. I know I've always said to our staff and our management team and others that, you know, I wanted to run a business where people could be proud to work at, they can afford to live in the community that we're doing business in. I think business in general, and justifiably in many cases, have taken a brunt of the blame for not doing enough. And I definitely think that is true. I, for one, have always wanted to wonder whether it could work or not. I was willing to take the chance, and I'd rather have the business fail doing the right thing than succeed doing the wrong thing. And I think that is a fairly good sum up of how I approach business, and also try to inspire other businesses to follow our lead. And I have been contacted by other businesses like myself to figure out how to do a foundation of their own so they can give back. We started Bread and Butter Collective, which is a group of independently owned hospitality businesses, where we're sharing information on how to succeed, but with a mandate for climate action, living wages, benefits, and all of those things. So I'm encouraged by all those efforts, and also encouraged by the community that we're in, the fact that we're having this conversation, and other conversations around housing and affordability and all those things. So I think we're fortunate, but we do have to roll up our sleeves and expect better. And I do think that we can expect better. And there is people in our community that are really wanting to do better. So where others may see doom and gloom, I see hope. And yeah, it's exciting to challenge ourselves to do better. And I think that's what I get a thrill out of it from an entrepreneur standpoint, is just looking at all these things as solvable problems, but not just problems, solvable.
Thanks. Ending on a very hopeful note. So Pamela.
I agree. I echo everything that's already been shared, and I appreciate what Bronwyn and Calen and yourself, Diana, has shared as well. I guess to close it, is like the main source of income for most people in BC is through employment, obviously, and that's why like paid wages are often ways like employment could influence health, but also like Bronwyn mentioned, like things that employees need to survive, like affordable housing and proper benefits and pensions. And the declining quality of work for employment conditions directly impacts workers' health. And to have like I really related to what Bronwyn said about what kind of city we want, and we want an equitable and healthy future for all. And when we talk about other sorts of ways that could benefit workers, like housing and benefits, sometimes that offloads the responsibility of the social and economic security of our government, which is why we should be implementing and demanding our government to implement a living wage or a higher minimum wage to, relate and close the gap from the minimum wage to the living wage, as workers are often put in precarious low wage situations that do not pay enough to make ends meet. And we know that. And many workers are often working multiple jobs, and they're still forced to choose between paying rent and paying groceries. And we need a wage that should not only allow people to survive, but should empower workers and people to be able to live together and have a savings account, have adequate pensions, and purchase a house, since housing was mentioned a lot. Those are my last 2 cents.
Thank you. And no, everybody was ending on this beautiful message of hope. And I was going to just put it out there, a couple of numbers that aren't super positive, but just to have on the radar that 14% of children in Victoria live in poverty, and 1 in 5 households in Victoria and Vancouver are below the living wage. So it isn't just sort of this kind of myth out there always that it's kind of youth working for spending money, or women working for a bit of extra spending money. Like this is people's family incomes across all sectors. Many of that's in the social sector, and doing core work in our communities with seniors, with youth and recreation, all sorts of programming. So but in terms of ending on a message of hope, all of you have spoken about the positive vision of our community, and we've seen that we can move the needle on the living wage through policy and practice, and that we're raising the floor for everyone by even just having this conversation. So I want to thank all of you for being here today to have this conversation with us, for taking the time, and for the important work all 3 of you are doing out in the community, the incredible value you bring every day to making this the city we all want to live, work, and play in.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.